Welcome to Todd Neef's show, where I talk to interesting people with interesting brains and try to unpack their mental models and learn out loud for the edification and enrichment of you, the loyal listeners of this podcast. This week we have John Murphy, a childhood friend of mine and also a co-founder of Young Horses. He's the gameplay designer there, and Young Horses rose to prominence off the backs of a school project from DePaul's game design program, which we get into in this podcast. But they made a game called Octodad that some of you may have played or seen, and it's a very fun / frustrating / hilarious game. So I recommend checking that out if you haven't. And John is part of the team that is releasing Bug Snacks sometime soon, holiday 2020, I believe, although I don't think they have a specific date on it yet. So we talk about a bunch of stuff related to gameplay design, to influences and the artistic aspect of video games, which is interesting to me, right? Because I grew up playing a ton of role-playing games, and I'm not an active gamer by any means, but try to draw some parallels between different forms of art like music and cinema, etc., and video games, which I think are an underrated form of quote unquote high art. And I think of John as the driver of the Egg Van, which was a hilarious turquoise-ish blue van that, we would drive from the Chicago suburbs to the Fireside Bowl pretty much every weekend in high school, and covered in just a horrible, ugly, disgusting array of punk and ska stickers. And John was one of the earliest people in our group to get his driver's license. So he was the designated driver to Fireside Bowl concerts. And I think the Egg Van eventually was used by WASPs as some sort of housing development project, and I think sent for scrap. So that's real sad. But people in the world know John as a game designer, and I know him as an Egg Van driver. But this conversation is hopefully a combination of the two for you. So check it out. I suppose we can start with a hard-hitting question. Is it okay to use the power of modern technology and whatever insights we've gleaned from psychology, etc., to basically lock people into fantasy worlds where they're not actually producing anything external to that fantasy world? Is that ethical?
Ooh.
Not on the list of topics that we presented a second ago.
Yeah, I don't know. That's tricky because I guess it depends to some degree on how much people seem to want to be locked in those fantasy worlds. There's some amount of you got to let people do what they want to do and make their own choices. But also, I feel like, it's the same thing as with social media or something, where people's brains can be hacked in ways that, where it's they feel like they want the thing, but it's actually bad for them, So I wouldn't want to build certain kinds of things like that. I purposefully try to build things that have an end. Some more. I don't want to build a huge open-ended thing that's going to take over someone's life. Probably partially because my the thing that brought me into wanting to make games. I mean, I wanted to make games when I was a kid, but I decided to actually do it while being a basement-dwelling, post-college, unemployed, living with my mom, playing World of Warcraft all day, every day. And so I was locked into one of those fantasy worlds where I was doing a ton of work and building things and investing a lot in something that didn't really mean anything or accomplish anything. But me doing that made me realize one, if I'm going to be spending this much time on games, maybe I should make them instead of just play them. But also some of the skills and kinds of work that I like to do, I've discovered playing that game more so than like high school or college classes where like you learn content but don't learn about like what kinds of work you like to do and what the actual jobs related to the field that you're studying are like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's an interesting distinction, I guess, between like different types of games as well, right? I mean, you don't hear arguments like that about like soccer or whatever, right? I mean, someone might look down on someone for being a jock, but it's not like you're wasting your life playing this sport. Like, what do you hope to gain from your sport that you play?
Right.
You know?
And in that sense, like it is, yeah, I don't see any difference in that sense between games and or video games and other kinds of games, right? Like sports are a subset of games, as far as I'm concerned. And, you know, the like relationships involved, I think that's a big part of it. Like what's the quality of the relationships that you build in whatever you're doing? You know, the older I get, the more relationships are kind of the thing that I care about most. So that's kind of would be a core, I guess, criterion for whether or not the experiences that I'm building or that I am engaging in that other people build are worthwhile experiences or whether they're healthy, things like that.
Yeah, I think there's also probably an element that you sort of started to touch on with stuff like social media, where people can feel like games are hacking their preferences, right? And you made sort of like a revealed preference argument of like, oh, well, people may say that they want to whatever, go outside more or volunteer more or whatever, but they just don't actually do it. They prefer to stay inside and look at social media or watch Netflix or play World of Warcraft or what have you. So the revealed preference is, you know, the reality of what they're actually doing, right? And I think that a lot of people may not have, let's say, a detailed understanding of that kind of argument and like really think through the different implications of that. But I think there's an element of both. You don't want to make a revealed preference argument if someone is being manipulated, right? It's not like, you know, the revealed preference of someone to like get tricked. You know, that their actual preference isn't to be fooled into, you know, giving a con man their money, right? They just like got tricked, right? And similarly, you know, that someone could make an argument that, oh, these games are like hacking some sort of innate human drive for novelty and structure and like task-based completion or whatever, and that people are just sort of like experiencing some type of intellectual junk food that sort of like hooks them, and that might be, you know, where that negativity comes from. And that you wouldn't make that same argument about like, oh, your brain is hacked by how much you want to go play basketball or whatever.
So I guess you could make that argument. You know, like I was just saying, I'm watching The Last Dance, and there's like something kind of dark and unhealthy and kind of fucked up about like how Michael Jordan's attitude towards basketball was.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I agree with all that. It's interesting that a lot of the games that people spend a lot of time on now, right? Like World of Warcraft is like still big, but it's not like the main thing. What's interesting, you know, like Fortnite is the biggest thing now, and Fortnite weirdly is closer to just being social media, where it's just like it is the playground. It is like a common space, right? They show movies in there now. It's just like and like there are concerts in there. So it's like a little bit of a step towards like virtual reality stuff. And that's like much more complicated, the questions of like whether or not that is an unhealthy way of spending time or like, I feel like that's going to be more complicated than like standard video game stuff. Same goes for like a lot of the games, the mobile games that like were addictive and hook people and have the microtransactions where people spend both a lot of time and money on them. They're still out there, but they're not like in the middle of the conversation anymore. It might just be that they're still doing the exact amount of what they do, and they're just not as interesting, so you don't hear about them. But I do think that something about that is shrunken. There's also some interesting stuff going on with like, what's I gonna say, the like microtransactions and sort of like gambling like mechanics where you open a random loot box to get like a hat that you want. That's like very, I guess that's the new mutation of that sort of gambling brain hacking thing. And a lot of governments in Europe are now like cracking down on that.
Oh, interesting.
And developers are kind of like, this isn't worth dealing with trying to figure out how to do this in a way where we're not going to get regulated. So let's just find a different way to make money.
Got it. So essentially the European approach, I mean, I guess to tech in general of regulation, right? In some cases kind of like bizarre and ham-fisted, maybe in other cases more appropriate. But, you know, that I guess what you're saying is developers are sort of taking the stance of like, we're not going to try to figure out how to make an EU version of this game versus a rest of the world version of this game. And essentially the EU's regulation has just sort of like exported itself worldwide based upon the cost of trying to create multiple versions. Is that what's going on?
That seems to be the case, but we've been talking about, like MMOs and like mobile games that you play forever. And
can you define MMO for people?
Massively multiplayer online, like the World of Warcraft type games, which, none of these things are super like, well, none of these types of games are the kind of games that I actually make. And I've been like, I haven't had my eye on like the market nearly as much as I was a few years ago in the last few years, just because I've been so like head down working on our game. And it hasn't been relevant because like we decided what our game was going to be, and we're locked into what the shape of it was going to be enough that like paying attention to like what Fortnite is doing, like that's not relevant to, we're playing a different game than that.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that another potential concern that people may have from like an ethical perspective has to do with thinking about, my perspective is it's like a misapplied concern of opportunity cost, right? Where it's like, oh, you're just sitting here and playing video games instead of blank, right? And in some cases, there probably are people who are playing video games instead of doing something that they would rather do, in their sort of like most high-minded self. But in a lot of cases, it's like, okay, well, what activity is playing video games displacing, right? It's probably not, someone deciding to read Solzhenitsyn or research some important topic or whatever. It's like, well, they probably would have just been watching TV.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
TV is the answer.
Yeah.
And games are sometimes like, I mostly watch movies or TV because like playing games now is like too much work for me after doing actual work. But yeah, I agree that it would just, in most cases, it's just a replacement for TV. That's kind of the same. It's just like what people want to do when they want to just chill out.
Yeah. Well, and I think you could make a reasonable argument that in most cases, and even on the margins in most cases, right, that playing a video game is probably like a better activity for someone to do than watching TV.
Yeah, and there's some evidence and studies about how games improve different kinds of like mental sharpness and like spatial reasoning and various things depending on what kind of game. So like if you wanted to, I don't really care about any of that, but like if you wanted to, you could certainly make arguments for games being a better use of time than a lot of the other leisure activities that people do.
Sure, totally. Yeah, I mean, I'm always skeptical of those kind of like, oh, you improved like this ability with spatial reasoning or whatever, where it's like,
oh, right, because it doesn't the context. What's the thing where it doesn't switch between contexts
it's not
at all?
translatable. It's like great,
right.
You can get really good at this like Lumosity game or whatever, which was a website that had a bunch of memory games and things like that. But the translation into anything other than the same Lumosity game is like basically non-existent.
Right. Yeah.
But all that said, I do think that there probably is something to the argument of like, okay, if you're replacing a passive activity like television watching with a more active activity like game playing, that might be an okay thing to do in most cases.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Great, we convinced ourselves. Great. So to sort of pull back from the hard hitting ethical discussions of our times. Young Horses started as a school project and has been a continuing company for a long time. And you guys have built, a successful game in Octodad, and you have Bug Snacks coming out soon. What are the dynamics like? Most people did projects in school and hated them and had bad group members and, were either the person who didn't do the work and some nerd like bossed everyone around and did the work, or they were the person who was like, why the hell isn't anyone doing any work? I guess I'll just finish it myself. I've been both of those people in different school projects. Right. So the idea of a school project becoming, an actual company that is successful is strange. Why did that happen?
It happened because there were a couple of adjunct faculty at DePaul where we were for school who saw the program, that the game development program there, and we're like, this is not anywhere near what actually working in the games industry is like, and doesn't just like isn't preparing people to actually work. So they put together a project that was just like kind of like an extracurricular summer project that was basically just like get hired at a fake game studio and work on a game for a few months with a specific goal of making something to enter into the Independent Games Festival, which is sort of like, what would you call it? What's maybe like the Sundance of games. So, and that game festival has a like student game specific award that they give out. So yeah, they basically hired 50 or so people applied, and we were just like put together into a team of about 20 and just put in a room and had some like guidance from these like mentors who actually work and are management type level people in the game industry. So I think that's a big part of why it worked, is that they did a pretty good job of hiring and figuring out who both like were able to do things and were like driven to do things because in any school, a lot of people don't have a particular kind of drive, or like I don't know exactly how to describe this, but you know what I'm talking about, right?
Well, do you mean like the teachers, the students, the administrators?
I mean, the students. I mean, like in any program at any school, there's a certain number of students who are like, I vaguely want to be, let's say, a computer scientist. So that's the program I'm going to go into. But like they've been on rails through school and everything their whole life. So then once you get to this point where you need to start actually thinking about like, there's that switch that flips where you realize that you need to actually do stuff to make stuff happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think that maybe what you're saying is like there's in school you have a curriculum that's laid out for you, and your goal isn't necessarily to actually learn how to do the thing. It's to sort of like check the boxes of the curriculum along the way to receiving a degree, which then qualifies you to receive a job where you'll theoretically have the, tasks that you must do laid out in front of you, and maybe some internal political dynamics. And basically people can go their whole lives without learning the actual thing. They just sort of learn to optimize for checking the boxes that are appropriate and to, not get in trouble with the wrong people.
Right. And that like basically learning that like the rules and systems that you think are there, like kind of aren't there, and kind of when they are there don't matter or don't make sense.
Yeah, sure.
So, some of us, and it was even a subset of this 20 people, because a lot of those people on that original Octodad team. So we made Octodad in this program. Octodad is a game where you play as an octopus with a human family, and they don't realize you're an octopus. It's like physical comedy game where you just like try to do laundry, and like you don't actually do laundry, but like yeah.
There's no laundry level?
No.
Oh,
maybe
geez.
maybe if we ever do another Octodad, but like you try to mow the lawn or do dishes, and it's just like a hilarious disaster, and so we came up with this, basically a prototype of this, because we were, as students, we were not like professionals, but we made something that was like very rough around the edges, but like the core of it was good. I'm on a tangent now, but so yeah, we made this game as students that got enough attention. It wasn't even like the award Independent Games Festival thing that we did get selected as like a finalist for, but didn't actually win. It was like the fact that we released the game for free and like got a lot of attention for it, and it just kind of like went viral, and like that part. And we've always kind of been this like, not, we've tried to be a little bit like artistic, but also we a little bit more of just like an accessible thing that like a broad audience will enjoy. And that was the kind of the start of that sort of dynamic, where it's, you know, it was the people and not the critics who loved Octodad.
Oh, interesting.
I feel like there was something that I was talking about before I got off on this tangent.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that the thing that I think is really interesting about it, right, is that, like you said, it's a group of students effectively thrown together that created something that seemed to resonate with people, right? And that is abnormal. You know, the number of school projects, sort of like I said before, that actually create something that is valuable to the world is not very high. Very few school projects make something that anyone cares about.
That is, yeah, that is definitely true. I think that another reason that we were able to do this, it was just like luck, in that there was this moment where we were at the border of a console generation. So, you know, going from PlayStation 3 to PlayStation 4 and Xbox 360 to Xbox One. Yeah. Those two things were happening, so that whenever that happens, there's a little bit more room to like get some weird stuff in there, because like when a new console is coming out, the platforms want to have just like a big range of stuff to get as many people as possible excited about the console as you can. And then I think in like bigger picture, there was some sort of, there's this moment like kind of between 2007 and 2010 when people were really interested in like weird games.
Yeah.
And it just kind of felt really open. And we just, in both of these ways, we were just kind of in the right place at the right time. And we're just like super lucky. Like right now, like making a game of the quality of the original sort of prototype Octodad, like that would just get completely lost right now. I don't know what, I wouldn't advise someone in the position I was in. It was literally 10 years ago, which feels insane, but like, I don't think that could happen the same way now. I think that maybe there's some other kind of weird angle that you could play if you're a student, but I don't know what it is.
Sure, totally. So let me ask you about the dynamic of weird games. Because I mean, before Octodad, you had also made Acid Couch as like a school project. Do people know about Acid Couch? Is that listed on the official Young Horses bio?
It's not. I mean, very few people know about Acid Couch. Devin, one of our programmers, and I made that with the help of some of our musician friends. So it was Andy and Dan, right?
I know Andy wrote the music. I bet he probably just had Dan play drums on it.
Yeah. But Um, yeah, that was just kind of a separate little weekend project that Devin and I did once. And everyone on the team has most people on the team have little side projects like that. And it's kind of interesting looking at sort of different subsets of the team and what their little side projects look like. Like Devin's and mine was definitely the least accessible, most weird. It's the sort of thing where it's no one's going to try to make money off of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess related to that, right? So there, like you said, there seemed to be this. I mean, was it sort of like a latent interest in weird games, or was it sort of like starting to bubble up? Was it something that you were aware of that was like a scene, right? Was it like a music scene where you're like, oh, we're gonna make we're in Memphis and we're going to make a record that sounds like 3 6 Mafia because that's what we're into? Or was it just kind of like you just made something you thought was cool and weird and it happened to coincide with like a wave in the gaming community?
No, there were definitely a few like high profile independent games that were like sort of like high concept or like pretty good art, at least at the time, sort of thing where I was like, oh, I could make something like, let's make a game that can make people cry. That was like the sort of like thing in the air at the time. And that's like kind of what I was going for, trying to make things that were like artistically relevant, but that could reach enough of an audience that it could actually be some amount of a cultural force. And I was like ignorant enough to think that I could do that. Sure.
Are there like regional game scenes? Is that a thing? For myself, where I'm reasonably knowledgeable about music, right? You can think about different genres of music and like the regional variations of those genres. You can think about something similar with maybe cuisine, where you're like, oh, okay, like I had this Lebanese food and I can see how it's similar to yet different from, Persian food or whatever, right? And you can sort of see these like layers of cultures kind of on top of each other. You can probably do something similar with like cinema. What's the landscape like for video games with that?
So I guess it's different now than it was when we were starting. But when we were starting, there are scenes kind of there are strong indie scenes and scenes where people are doing kind of like weirder, more interesting stuff in cities where there's a big like AAA, like big budget game industry, because people sort of cycle in and out or just do side projects and things like that. So places like San Francisco and Seattle and Austin have that. Chicago has never really had like a big indie scene. We have like a respectable kind of like it's a very Midwestern kind of like most of the games people are making are like
about like corn.
Yeah. Well, the almost like the first thing that comes to mind is like a sim tower influence, like sim games, like things that are very kind of like down to earth and kind of like mellow, which are nice, and very like just feels appropriate for most of what the experience of being just like a nice Midwesterner is like. But yeah, I feel like some amount of there is a scene, but it's much more online. There were a lot of people back then. There's also a lot of interesting like games writing and criticism and like people like trying to convince each other online that these sorts of things were possible, and people writing about just like interesting criticism as a way of pushing on and highlighting parts of games that were interesting.
Yeah, so I have a theory about the dangers of, let's say, like a hyper-connected world, right, where the internet has brought a lot of connection, which on the surface seems like a good thing for innovation since you have a lot of access to new information, new ideas, et cetera. But I have a hypothesis that that's actually been very negative for innovation and creativity, because in a hyper-connected network, you get like easily stuck on local maxima, right? It's like whatever is sort of like trendy becomes the thing. And it's very, very dangerous for, like we were talking about earlier, actually, with like negative incentives for creating, behavior hacking things. Because it's like, oh, all of a sudden you have to compete with apex predators with no scruples that will just sort of like do anything to win. And so that creates like a race to the bottom dynamic as well. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about you mentioned like the online scenes for game development, right? I mean, how did these groups sort of cluster, and were they sort of like modular in the sense that they were like disconnected from other paradigms of gaming or what have you? What does that look like?
That's a good question. All these, like the sort of online scenes that I'm talking about are things that I was like aware of and exposed to, but was never really a part of. So I don't know that much, but I do see, and I what came to mind for me actually with you saying, I agree with this idea that you want like sort of isolated petri dishes of a scene with like maybe some cross-pollination with other scenes, but you don't want like total awareness of everything. I think part of the reason that's like been an interesting thing with games is that they're so complicated and like hard to make that it's kind of hard to be super aware of what other people are doing.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's like every once in a while you'll come across a game once it's come out, and like, maybe you'll have some friends play your thing and give you some ideas, but so much of the time, at least for us, has been so cloistered, and we just kind of like so focused on building the thing.
Yeah, not to take you off your train of thought, because I think that's interesting, but just to give a frame of reference, Bugsnax is coming out, quote unquote, soon, right?
Yeah,
but you've been working on it for how long?
We've been working on it for almost 6 years.
Yeah,
and
right.
Yeah, it's coming out in sometime holiday time.
Yeah. So I mean, one can imagine that different games are going to have different development cycles, but is that typical? Is that atypical?
It is atypical for a core team of 8 to work on a game for 6 years. Basically, there's a trade-off between team size and amount of time, which it seems like that would, right? Like we could add more people and finish the same size game, but we just like decided to make a really ambitious, huge thing, and are very hesitant to add new people to our team. So it's a little bit weird, but like 2 or 3 years, I think, is probably more standard. Some of the bigger games, like really big games that have like 200, 300, 400 people working on them, sometimes have a 5 or 6 year development cycle. And, there are outliers, but yeah, I would say usually between 1 and 3 years is probably the most common.
Got it. Well, yeah. And then to circle back to what you were saying, I mean, it sounds like, this development cycle, and, in your case is longer, but that, like you said, it's sort of people retreating to create something for a significant period of time and then kind of putting that into the world. So, how does that relate then to the overall information economy of what's going on? Because you're kind of locked in too, right? It's like, okay, we are here. We've worked on this game for 2 years, and you're not going to be like, oh, the cool new thing is dubstep. Like we need a dubstep part. Like it's not going to happen like that.
Well, there's a whole other thing, but it can happen that way. There's this phenomenon in games that's usually referred to as early access that happens a lot now, where someone will build sort of like a minimum viable product of an idea, and they'll put it out and sell it for like less than what they will sell it when it is done.
That's cool.
So basically it's like an open beta where they're adding features, and it's a little bit more of like this active back and forth between a community and developers that we've never really done, just because that's a whole other type of dynamic, and managing that process is just like not something that we've learned how to do. But it's pretty common now, especially with like kind of bigger like systemic games where there's like a lot of where it's like, oh, we could have cars in this game, or we could have I don't know, dinosaurs. Like there's like all sorts of, or we could make it so that players can fly, or we could make it so that players can like dig into the ground. There's like, if there's like a whole bunch of different things that you could do and you don't know where to start, you don't know what to prioritize, you can release like an early version of the thing and see what parts people get excited about and lean into those.
I mean, that actually is one of the questions that I had written down, is like, okay, in most other scenarios, you want some ability to gather market feedback, right? And if you're locked into this long development cycle, it's like, yeah, you can have people play test, but that's really, really tough, right? And in other areas, you know, like movies, for example, it's sort of a scattershot approach of like, no one knows anything. You know, you have some idea that Avengers 2 or whatever is going to make money, but the business model is like, we're just going to try a bunch of things that look like things that we know work, and some percentage of them are going to work, and we don't know which ones. And, you know, I'm curious what that looks like for like gaming studios.
But do they not like focus test things for like big Marvel movie things? And bigger games do this too, where you can do everything from like user experience stuff where you're like tracking where people's eyes are looking to like figure out if the UI is broken. I'm sure that you can find ways to, or yeah, like doing sort of play tests where you pick like a random representative player and like ask them what they thought was cool or not cool about the thing. We don't exactly do that. We do a little bit. It's mostly our friends who end up play testing. And it's like such a small sample. It really is like ill-advised in terms of trying to build a marketable product the way that we do it. But I think that to some degree, there's a balance there between making something that's just like what you want to make, that is like going to be weird and hopefully like unique in some way that people are going to like because it is unique, but you also need to have some amount of understanding what the overall audience that you're going for is going to like, and have some amount of accessible, like baseline interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that something like a video game is a really interesting example of finding that trade-off, right? Because one can imagine, you know, let's say music as maybe on a more extreme end of like, okay, you can be an artist who's just going to sort of like write what you want to write, and then say that, you know what, that's going to resonate with my fans. And like, yeah, you do potentially have some intuition about like what works and what doesn't work. And maybe you have a label that inserts a producer who tries to make you write certain types of songs, or tells you that you know, wait too long before you get to the hook in this song. And, you know, that they can sort of insert things like that. But in a video game, there's not just the element of, oh, okay, here's the overall vision that we want to have, and here's the story that we want to have. There's like a literal element of, does playing this work, and is it fun? Where you need to have the actual user experience as like a prominent aspect of the creative part, even if you're very far on the end of like, I'm just going to do what I want. Like, you just can't have a game that's like, oh, this is impossible. Like, the hit detection is all off, or like this part is too frustrating or whatever. Although I guess Battletoads was popular.
Right. And no one ever finished it. Yeah. And that was fine. It's interesting looking at the data. I don't know what it is for Octodad off the top of my head, but you can see what percentage of people finish the game. And it's not very high. A lot of people lose interest and don't finish a lot of games. But yeah, that's interesting. The point about what was I going to say?
I mean, just about balancing the need for having some understanding of the user experience with like your own creative vision. That video games probably by nature even if you are way more on the end of like, fuck it, I'm doing whatever I want, you still need a lot more user feedback than you might for other like genres of creative output.
Yeah, I think people talk about, so you can think about the experience of playing a game as a conversation between the developers and the player. And you could do that with any medium, any kind of art. You can think about it that way, but it's a little bit more, the player is driving some part of that conversation a little bit more than with listening to a song, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that I think conversation is a good example of that.
And sometimes that conversation is super one-sided, where the developer is like is forcing the player to say do something they don't want to do. That's like an interesting, there's this idea of ludonarrative dissonance, where what the story of the game is telling you and what the gameplay of the game is telling you. Like in a game where you're like this like charismatic, friendly adventurer who just like murders hundreds of people, like what the game tells you to do. So that's like kind of an interest. And then there are other games that take that kind of dynamic and like play with it on purpose and like point it out and do some kind of interesting meta stuff. It's a, which I guess is a form of that thing where like movies about movies tend to be really win a lot of Oscars, and also maybe seem to work pretty well or something. And they're like kind of games that are about games. That's like a thing that happens.
Sure. Do you have an example for those of us not well versed in such tropes?
BioShock, which was a game that takes place in like a city that like basically like is it Ayn Rand? Yeah. Like a Randian like society is away from everywhere else, is like built underwater, like at the ocean floor, and like it is like fallen into ruin, and you're like exploring this like destroyed place and like learning about like the sort of thing. But in that there is there's this thing that happens where you're just sort of like doing what a voice tells you to do. There's like the sort of like villain is like telling you don't know it's the villain. Someone's like helping you through, like telling you like, hey, now you need to go to the like medical wing, or like now you need to go to like the city hall in this place, and you're going through the whole game just sort of doing what they say. And then there's a point at the end where they like tell you to like kill someone, and like you don't have a choice. So there's like some stuff about like free will, and also the experience of playing a game where like you're not really, when you feel like you have choices in a game, people say like, people try to make these sorts of games where you like make moral choices, like, oh, do you rescue this person, or do you become a villain in the game? It's like you don't really have, it's all predetermined in some, constrained by the systems of the game. So I guess that's an example of that.
Yeah, totally. So your specific role with Young Horses is a little bit ambiguous and multifaceted, and something I'm curious about for you, right? Sort of having a creative hold over a lot of different aspects of the actual games that are being created, is what does the process look like for being influenced by something in order to create a video game, right? I can imagine what that looks like for music myself, where it's like, yeah, I like this riff, I'm going to come up with a riff that sounds like it. I like the way this song has this little trick on this transition, I'm going to steal that idea, right? What does that look like for a video game?
It's very similar to that. Sometimes, so occasionally you're trying to build something that's totally like new and different. So that might be just trying to like write something from scratch, which sometimes and then like sometimes when you do that, you're just experimenting and playing around, building something. It'll like surprise you because you're building a thing and playing it, and you're prototyping and then like playing it, and and sometimes we'll be like, oh, that's nice. So that's the sort of experience of like writing something from scratch. But then also there's parts of the game that you don't want to have to think about. This is sort of at the other end of the spectrum, where it's like, what does the pause menu look like? Or like what does like there's like pop-ups for quests in the game that pop up in the corner of the screen, or like have a little flourish in the middle of the screen when you completed a task and things like that. Like you might like dress that up in your own unique way that fits the art style of your game. Like sometimes you just don't want to think about some of the like superstructure of the thing. So then you just look at games that you feel like have done it well, or that there are like YouTube channels that just like have like, here's a list of all of the pause menus from all these games. So you can just look at them and be like, oh, that feels about right for this kind of game. And then in the middle, there's just sort of being inspired by a thing. So for example, a pretty recent game that I think is one of it's my favorite game of all time is the most recent Zelda game, which is...
Why is it your favorite?
Because it gets across the feeling of being on an adventure better than anything else. It's this open world thing where you just sort of like get lost in little... You have like an intended goal, and on the way you like see something on the horizon. You're like, oh, what's that? And then you wander over, and then like you're doing some other thing for 15 minutes that's as interesting and as like the sort of like main quest of the game. And then it also has these sort of really interesting like systems where you have a subset of abilities. For example, the ability to like freeze an object in time and then hit it with a weapon, and it like stores the forces, and then after a few seconds it releases all of the force that you've applied to it. So you can do it. It's meant for, say, like freezing a rock, hitting it with a sword a bunch of times, and the rock goes flying and like breaks open a wall that you're to some secret passage you're trying to enter. But then you can use that same thing to not like you cut down a tree, use this ability to like freeze the tree in time, hit the tree with your sword a bunch of times, stand on the tree and like ride the tree through the air across ride it like a, I don't know, like I guess that's not a thing. I was going to say like surfboard, but you're in the air. I don't know.
The Silver Surfer.
Yeah. So, and then there are like a few various other things like that you can sort of, that interact with each other in interesting and surprising ways. So building like a set of toys that like do really interesting things in tandem. So like that game is huge. Hundreds of people worked on it. It is made by Nintendo, so like the amount of like polish and like just the production values are much bigger than anything that I'm going to make. But I thought that was really awesome. So I was inspired by that in building the different. As an aside, Bug Snacks is a game about capturing creatures that are half bug and half snack, like a grasshopper that is a banana, or let's see, what's another one? Like a stag beetle that is like a steaming, angry baked potato. And so I built all of the traps and tools that you use to capture these bug snacks. And I was inspired by the this Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the name of this game, and it is so I took that idea of like there are these different abilities that you have that interact with each other in different ways and are kind of simple in and of themselves. So say like a launch pad that you can use to throw other traps into the air, or throw bugs into the air, or throw yourself into the air if you stand on it, combined with a sort of like tripwire sort of thing with suction cups that you can attach to different surfaces in the world so that flying bug snacks run into it. And then you can take the launch pad, put the tripwire on it, and fling it to a surface that you couldn't otherwise get it to. So that it's not directly stealing. Sometimes you directly steal, sometimes you adapt, and sometimes you build some things that you think are novel, and then later on you figure out that there was some other game that did them 20 years ago that you just didn't play.
So it's just kind of a matter of, you experience something, whether it's a way of interacting with the game world or maybe some twist in a narrative or whatever, and you sort of internalize that as like, oh, this is a way to do something, which then if you plug that into whatever your world is, gives you ideas.
Yeah, that's about right.
With, for example, I mean, you mentioned the Zelda game as a potential inspiration. Being ignorant of the dynamics here, is there someone who is it the equivalent of, okay, my favorite guitar player is Marty Friedman because I love his solos on Megadeth's Rust in Peace? Is there a similar dynamic where you're like, this person is the person who has this unbelievable capacity for understanding creative ways to interact with a gameplay world? Or is it just like Nintendo is hundreds, if not thousands, of top-of-the-line developers slaving away in some hidden enclave, just churning out games that then we just experience and don't really understand how they came to be?
I think it's both of those things at the same time. For the most part, there's a lot less auteurism because it's so much harder for an individual to make a game, and most of the people doing a lot of the nitty-gritty work of building the thing are invisible. But there are some, right? I mean,
because I'm looking back on my youth loving role-playing games, right? And I loved Squaresoft. But it's like I don't know anyone there were no names associated with Squaresoft. I was just like, oh, yes, Squaresoft.
Yeah, and there probably is some creative director who is responsible for some key aspects of what you loved about those games. And then it also, in a lot of cases, with Nintendo, I think it comes down to they have some sort of process. There's something about the way that they the processes that they use for developing that really hone things. But I don't have a lot of here is an individual person who I am inspired by and want to emulate exactly. It's much more, even for me, it's a lot more indirect, or I'm looking at the product itself and maybe some game developers conference talk about how a particular system was built or how someone went about writing a game, writing the narrative of a game.
So it's maybe more you just kind of pick up nuggets like that rather than, like you said, sort of having an individual who you follow that you're like, oh, I need to see what level this person made. I must experience all of their levels.
There's probably another thing. It's been really interesting. The games that Bugsnax is getting compared to are a lot of the are you familiar with Rare? Rare is the developer that made a lot of the Nintendo 64.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
GoldenEye.
Yeah, I can remember the little, I don't know what the pre-roll thing is called. But yeah. What is that called?
I think it's just a logo.
Logo, sure. I don't know. Great.
But where without really realizing it, the sort of formative experiences the formative like games that that you play when you're young color what you end up building, and you don't even really realize how much you've been shaped by those things. And I'm sure that there's a similar thing for some, at least some, say, songwriters who aren't going like, this is my favorite guitar player, and that's why I'm doing it this way, and instead are just writing what they think is just coming out of them, and other people can see like, oh, this is because you were steeped in this and this while you were writing it, or when you were young, you know.
So let me ask you this then. So you were saying that Bugsnax is being compared to the Rare games?
Maybe not that. That might not be the most. That's not the most compared, but yeah, like.
Sure. Are there specific games where people are like, oh, this is a lot like whatever?
Well, there's some
Donkey Kong.
Right. There's some where, so like a very early version of Bugsnax was kind of a riff on Pokemon Snap.
Totally. Yeah.
Which was Pokemon Snap was like, you're like on a rail, like in like a boat or a car, and like taking pictures of Pokemon. And we had initially done that because when we started working on this like 6 years ago, like it was unclear whether or not like VR was actually going to take off this time. So we were like, oh, this would adapt really well to VR. And like, that was a cool game. And then like almost all that stuff got scrapped, other than like, you know, you're it's not on a rail, you're not really taking pictures, and it just like slowly turned into something very different. But people still will like compare it a little bit, and part of that is because like it still has like a Pokemon. There's still some winks to Pokemon in there, obviously, because you know you're hunting and capturing 100 different Bugsnax that have like silly names that they're saying out loud. You know, like, I don't know, the banana grasshopper is like a banopper, and it like just like flitters around saying its name.
Sure.
So there some of it's more obvious like that. But then I'm trying to think of a good example of something that, like Ape Escape. I don't know if you're familiar with that game. That was like another, just like a lot of these like very 90s games, like early 3D games that were a little bit, they were like kind of cartoony, a little bit busted, because like people didn't know how to like design cameras for 3D environments in games yet. And some of these were some of these were things that we explicitly looked at and were like, this is a game that we're gonna borrow some ideas from, and some of them are things that just someone on the team liked, and then it somehow seeped into the thing.
Do you experience, I guess, any frustration with the things that you get compared to? Right? If I think about this from a music perspective, almost everyone who I know who is a musician who has gotten any attention for their work is often just like compared to things that are like totally inappropriate for what they think they're doing, right? Where people are like, oh, like this is in the same vein as blank, blank, blank for fans of blank, blank, blank. And they're like, dude, that has nothing to do with the music that I'm making or that I think I'm making, right? And I think, my theory on this for the music perspective is that people come into listening to something with like a prior, right? And they have a frame of reference, and it's really easy to hear in music what you think you're going to hear, right? If you think like, oh, this is a band that sounds like this band, you can find parts that can form that narrative. So it's really easy for people to get kind of locked into stuff. And a lot of musicians are frustrated with that because they're like, actually, my influence, like you think that, I'm into this, but I'm actually into whatever. I can speak to that with like Rats, where people think that, oh, like members of Weekend Nachos, this is like a hardcore band, right? And people can hear that's always like, oh, there's like hardcore parts in our songs. It's like, no, like I can tell you exactly where that's stolen from, and it's stolen from Morbid Angel. Like it's just not like that part is a Morbid Angel part, right? And you see that with a lot of like famous musicians as well, where it's like, no, I'm not referencing the things that are currently popular, like I'm referencing James Brown. Like, this is the James Brown part. It's not like whatever you think it is.
I haven't had that much of an experience of that exactly, and maybe I'm not sure why that is. It might be that sometimes someone will compare, because like the influences aren't always as explicit, what I'm like trying to go for or what I'm stealing from. Someone might compare one of our games to something that I've never thought about or heard of, and I'll just be like, oh, that's interesting. Like, either if I have played, it's like, oh yeah, maybe there is some of that in there, or like, oh, that's cool, I've never played that before, so that's probably not in here, but that's interesting. One thing, so like we get a lot of like, right now we're dealing with a lot of like mostly like the sort of like Call of Duty gamer bro type dudes are like, this game is like for kids and is like was like this like cartoony like cutesy thing. So that's like, I mean, they haven't played the game yet, and that's how it presents. So like it's kind of okay as long as it doesn't turn off people who would be interested in playing the game, if the marketing is communicating it incorrectly. But it's less like frustration and more like, we don't want people to like get the wrong idea too much and have their expectations like violated in a way that is too upsetting.
Well, so I mean that's actually a good segue into the idea of, I mean, both Octodad and Bugsnax having this kind of like quirky, cutesy feel, but also being like dark and upsetting.
Yeah, I mean they're not necessarily. I wouldn't describe them as dark. I would describe them as, so like there's a wave of like games right now, like this like idea of like wholesome games, where like a game where like a game just came out called Ooblets, where it's a similar sort of like, you're collecting these cute little creatures and they have a rule in their development that like anything with a face cannot be eaten. So like we printed out a tweet about, like, one of the developers of that game tweeted like a while ago, like I'll say this for the last time, no, you cannot eat the Ooblets. And we just printed that and put it on the wall at one point, because it was just like a funny comparison to Bugsnax, where initially, I don't want to spoil too much about the game, but like it was darker at one point. And if it were as dark as it used to be, releasing it now would feel bad. What we go for is trying to make things that feel like authentic, like kind of like a Pixar thing or something, right? Where like it can be like there's a lot of like warmth and like kindness and heart. We try to make games that have a lot of like heart in a similar way to like a Pixar sort of thing, but we don't want to like shy away from or ignore like darkness, because that's like, you know, part of the thing. It's part of what you need to have something be, I don't know, a meaningful, impactful experience, I think.
Did I playtest the dark Bugsnax?
I don't know.
Neither do I.
I don't. Yeah, I can't really. We'll have to figure that out later.
Yeah. But okay, so I mean, I guess that.
So like Octodad is like this game where you're like flopping around and like breaking things, but it's, you know, a father needing to hide some terrible secret from his family.
Yeah.
And then eventually, being forced to reveal that secret. And in the case of that, he is accepted by his family and it has a happy ending. Bugsnax is about a collection of sort of misfits who go to this island because they think Bugsnax will solve their problems, because they're supposedly the most delicious thing in the world. So, for example, the musician character is like a one-hit wonder who has a creative block, and bug snacks are her muse. So there's like, there's a lot of like humor that you can do with that, and then but it also like there's some darkness and more sadness really in bug snacks.
So how do you balance, I guess, that potential issue of it seeming like a children's game or whatever when that's not really the goal?
Well, we're trying to do,
or is it?
Well, we had considered just like completely blindsiding people, but there's a lot of hints in like the marketing materials. Like the trailer for the game has like a sort of like post credits stinger moment that's like mysterious and dark, that hints that that the majority of the trailer that's super bright and happy isn't all that's there. We worked with. Are you familiar with the band Caro Caro Bonito?
No.
Like kind of the pop band based in London, and they did a theme song for Bug Snacks. It's very good, and all we really did was like let them see what like the music in the game is like, and what the story of the game. Basically, let them play the game, get the gist of it. The lyrics for that song have some hints about what's going on in the game, so that's another. Yeah, we're just trying to leave some breadcrumbs and hint at things without spoiling anything too much, but also without completely blindsiding people.
With the dynamic of the way that games are released, how does that work then? Is the assumption that the marketing is actually going to dictate who plays the game, or is it more like, okay, you have a built-in audience of X number of people, and then you expect to put it out and then allow those people to then disseminate it to others?
So we don't do a very good job of having a super well-defined audience that we're going for. So we just kind of try to create a sense of what the game actually is and make various stuff that we think will spread. Just trying to make some viral content. And like, we know we have some amount of a built-in audience from Octodad, so we lean a bit on that. I don't know what, like, I don't know how to generalize to everyone, but we kind of have been trying to tell a story and drip feed stuff about the world and the story of the game leading up to it. We're lucky in that we, again, are partnered with Sony and Epic also. For Epic is the developer and publisher of Fortnite, and have their own like PC basically PC gaming store. So we've like partnered with these two huge corporations that are doing a lot to help just spread the word. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, I guess what I'm thinking about is I'm imagining, I think we talked previously a little bit about just some parallels between like cinema and video games, right? Where it's like, okay, you have some sort of narrative with certain characteristics that you're trying to create, right? And if you think about the way that movies are often marketed, it's like, this is a romantic comedy. It has the romantic comedy movie poster that's white with like sort of like two characters making a certain type of face, and you know what it is. You're like, yes, I know what that movie is going to be like, right? And it seems like there's sort of things that are generated to fit within like a pre-existing cultural space, right? And obviously with Bug Snacks, you're like kind of purposefully not doing that, right? Where it's like, okay, this isn't necessarily a genre game that's going to fit cleanly into this genre. but that, you do have a certain type of narrative that you are trying to create. So it's a really interesting dynamic of like, okay, how do I make it clear, who should be exposed to this without necessarily giving away too much about what's happening?
Yeah, it's kind of weird because so a lot of games that like we kind of do fit into a type of game which has like a very vague name. Like adventure game is basically where you put anything that has like a story and it has a beginning and an end, and like maybe you're like jumping around or like collecting things, or like Mario game, modern Mario games are in that category. Like, did you ever play like Banjo-Kazooie or something?
Yeah.
It's like all of those. It's like, we kind of remind people of that. So we do lean a little bit into that. So like I guess you want to give an impression of just like the vibe of the game. So for example, the box art even though the game mostly, probably for the most part will not be a physical release. You still need like a box, the equivalent of like if you're watching Netflix, whatever, the poster that like has like, it's like cartoony and it shows characters like hunting bug snacks and it's like very bright. I don't know if in that we probably don't get any of the underlying like not super bright.
Yeah,
happy.
strangeness.
The strangeness is in there in the form of like there's like a cinnamon roll snail on a tree that like is dripping in like a pretty upsetting way. Like it looks kind of psychedelic.
Salvador Dali.
Yeah, and that's a thing. That's a thing that some of the team gets frustrated with, that people always make. They're like, oh, these guys must have been on so many drugs making these games, because we have like there's an absurdity and a strangeness that just inherently exists in our team, but like a lot of people feel like that needs to come from doing drugs because they haven't tried to make something, I guess.
I think that's also just a thing that people say.
Yes.
Right? It's like not even that they think that, but it's just like, rather than saying this is a weird game that has weird stuff, like you don't say that. You say these guys must have been high as hell when they made this game.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So maybe that will allay some of the concerns of the Young Horses team members who are upset at the accusations.
Yeah. Like people are the most important thing for a game is the trailer. People are going to watch a trailer before they buy a game. I know some people don't watch the trailer before they watch a movie, but most people do. And it gives you some idea of what it's about. Unless you specifically don't want it to. I guess movies do that sometimes too, where they'll have a trailer that is misleading on purpose if they have some sort of cool twist.
So is the goal then of the game, it can be all of these, but are you thinking about trying to tell a story? Are you thinking about trying to create a certain type of gameplay with like a certain type of problem solving? Are you thinking about attempting to just like create a mood for people? Are you attempting to create some specific type of surprise or wonder? Like, what is the actual intention of the art?
So, yeah, ideally you want all of those parts, right? Because games are basically all other art combined, right? There's a lot of there's all the visual art.
Games. Highest
best art. The perfect art. There's sound design, music, and all of it, and then the sort of like game mechanics, like what the player actually does. And you want, ideally, for all of those things to fit together nicely and reinforce each other, unless you're trying on purpose to make them clash with each other in a way that is trying to do or say a particular thing. We tend to try to make things that feel kind of like cohesive and like just like professionally fit together, which I think is part of why we're not like a pure experimental thing. We're trying to like have a package that's what makes something feel like polished and professional, is having all the elements jive with each other well. So in our case, it just started with, it can come from anywhere, I guess. Like it can come from making a prototype and then of a game. Like the original Octodad prototype was like a rope made out of gray spheres sitting on like a sink, like a 3D model of a sink with some like stuff on the edges of the sink, and you could control the end of the rope and use it to like clumsily knock stuff into the sink. And we're like, oh, that's funny. And the octopus thing kind of came later. Like an early version of Octodad, narrative wise, was like inspired by Being John Malkovich. It was just like a person driving another person. And it sort of like clumsily, strangely moving. So it's really hard at this point actually to remember like what comes first. You kind of like will like step one of those elements forward. Usually it's rarely like the sound design or music that is driving. Usually it's some combination of story and game mechanics, but art, and then also the visual art comes in a lot too. And like one of those things will take a step forward, and then one of the other things will be kind of pulled along by that, but then that other aspect will take another step forward. So they're all kind of pulling each other along.
Yeah, so it's like you start to create the world, and then, you know, I mean, I imagine I've heard authors say something like that, where it's like you create the world and you create the characters, and then you just let the characters tell you what they're going to do.
Yeah, it doesn't feel 100% like that because and I think it's because with writing, the sort of writing where you're creating a world, you don't have to worry about the game about that there being some bug that prevents the book from being the draft from being read. So there's like,
oh man, like the gravity in this part is all screwed up. I guess you just can't turn the page.
Yeah. But there is some element. There definitely is like some of that. Like, I think someone was telling me that they listened to that like episode of the Ezra Klein podcast where he talks to N.K. Jemisin.
Oh yeah, I listened to that.
How that was like, and like he also in that, it seemed like, oh, it's mind blowing that like when you're creating a world, you need to think about like economics and gravity and all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's what we do. So but it is, yeah, I don't know. So yeah, you're right. It is, the world building influences every aspect of it, but that's like almost a separate thing. I guess it's mostly tied to the writing, but
yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said world building specifically, since I think that there's like that's sort of like a reserved term to mean something specific. Maybe I meant more just that, you know, you have I don't know what to say other than world, but just like world of the game, where you're like, okay, I have this concept of what I want this to feel like. I have this concept of certain types of gameplay or scenarios that I want to happen. And then by virtue of having those two things, it's like you have something, and then all of a sudden there's whatever space around that thing. It's like, oh, okay, this thing exists. What's the space around that? Oh, maybe this is another piece that can exist, right? And you just kind of like are able to start seeing the space created by the things that you've started to pull together, and then pull those in, and it turns into something eventually.
Yeah, that's funny. I actually went to talk at one point where this is a game developer, Jonathan Blow, was presenting this idea of like, how do you find new stuff in games? How do you make stuff that's like actually new? And like explained it with an actual like visual field with like sort of like inroads cut into a space where it's like, this is like deeper into unknown territory, where you can like kind of take a shortcut into this space of newness, which is a little, I guess that's sort of related to what you're talking about. But yeah, it definitely is like a, as you're iterating and building stuff, building one thing opens up a lot of other directions that you could go with the next thing.
Yeah, I can imagine a visual analogy like you're talking about too, where it's like, okay, you've sort of built this landscape of things that are happening, and say you want to go from this conceptual area to a conceptual area over there. And historically it's been done by going this way. And it's like, oh, well, what if you just like made a wormhole between them? Right. And yeah, that's potentially where a lot of innovation comes from, is trying to solve some sort of problem of connecting different conceptual ideas and just doing it in a way that's completely different.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Great. Well, you can use that one in your next video game.
Thank you. Can't wait to find some wormholes.
So, if people want to play Octodad or Bugsnax or Acid Couch, can they play Acid Couch?
I don't know if Acid Couch is up. You go to Devin Scott Tunkin's website and see if it's functional. He keeps having to like up. I think like when Flash.
Yeah, it was a Flash game, right?
Yeah. So I think he's been meaning to convert it.
It's like you can probably play it, but like your computer will be like, do not install Flash under any circumstances.
Yeah, but Young Horses Games or Bugsnax or Octodad. If you Google any of those things, you'll find our stuff.
And what's the deal with the Bugsnax release? It's going to be, and you mentioned Sony and Epic are helping promote it. What's the story?
So it's going to be out sometime like holiday 2020 on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, and the Epic Games Store for PC and maybe Mac.
And do you have any internet presence that you want people to pay attention to or look into?
Yeah, I'm not really on Twitter very much, but when I am at JOH and then 6 M's. Jom.
So yeah, literal character M times 6.
Yes.
Great. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.